Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. It's great to be with you here, wherever you're listening, in your car or anywhere else. Glad to be here with you. I'm so honored that you have chosen to take time to listen to this podcast. And, before we get into the conversation with Jackson Waters today on Neo-Calvinism, I wanted to make sure you know about the Patreon. I typically only mention this at the end of the episode, but some people don't get to listen to that for whatever reason. So I want to make sure you know about the Patreon. If you sign up on my Patreon at $5 or $15 a month, you get swag sent to you via the Patreon. You can interact with me directly, ask me any questions. It's a great way that we can have private communication. Maybe you've left a comment on YouTube or sent me an email before, but this is a great way to help me bring great content to you. I love to hear from my patrons as well. You can always suggest guests, topics, all that kind of stuff on the Patreon. So go sign up on the link in the show notes. I'll put a link down there for you. And I would love your support. It would be a great way to help me bring great content to you. I think my content is outstanding, but I'm a little biased. So maybe if you like it too, head over to the Patreon, sign up today. Let's get into today's episode with Jackson Waters on Neo-Calvinism. Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's good to be with you here this morning. We are recording Friday, September 13th, a bad day in cultural lore, but it's a great day for me. It's my 16th wedding anniversary, so we're going to go out and have a nice steak dinner. But before we do that, I've got a great conversation with a good friend, Jackson Waters. Jackson, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to hear a little bit more about you. I think we've met a few times, but I wanted to hear more of your story. I believe you are Anglican, you are going to RTS, but kind of tell me more of your background, give the audience kind of some understanding of where you're coming from, your walk with Christ, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So quick version is I was homeschooled, oldest of five growing up, went to Union University in West Tennessee. I've kind of been in the political world my whole life, being in Northern Virginia most of my life. My dad has worked in politics most of his life. And so that's been very much a natural milieu, but I felt most at home in the church, felt a call to ministry when I was 13 years old. At the church where I now serve. So my most full-time job is being a director of youth ministry at my local church. But I also have done work with American Reformer, and I'm the executive editor at Theopolis Institute on their online side. So I kind of am living in a few different worlds. I've been in the Anglican church most of my life, but also growing up was in PCA and EPC, as well as 9 Marks Baptist churches. So that's the very brief version. I never knew a time when I wasn't a Christian, but there's been several kind of real renewals of my faith along the way.
For sure, that's great. And you said you went to Union University. That's in Tennessee, right?
That's right. Oldest evangelical school in the country, over 200 years old now. But yeah, really solid. So I love my time there, and a lot of the experience. I count it as a really valuable experience.
That's great. Excellent. Well, you wrote an article for American Reformer, and there's a famous book, or it's probably not famous, but like in theological circles, a big book that came out this year or last year about Neo-Calvinism. Mm-hmm. And Neo-Calvinism is a word that probably most people are unfamiliar with. It's kind of one of those nerd conversations, but I think your article really gives a very incisive kind of overview of the Neo-Calvinist movement, especially in the 20th century, born out of Herman Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper. So I wanted to kind of talk through it. Obviously, some of my background is coming out of that Neo-Calvinism, being formerly affiliated with Acts 29 and learning from who I didn't know at the time were Neo-Calvinists. I don't even know if they know that they're Neo-Calvinist, but that was kind of the waters I was in. And I'm still friends with many people who would be, I guess, Neo-Calvinists. But in order to do that, I need to know, what is Neo-Calvinism? What are we talking about here? I think I could articulate it, but I'd love to hear from you since you wrote the article. How would you define Neo-Calvinist for kind of the average person in the pew?
Yeah, that's a great question. Neo-Calvinism proper is the expression of Reformed Christianity, particularly, I'd say, like Reformed soteriology, as it appeared in the Netherlands in the late 19th and early 20th century, which I think tries to express the Reformation in modern language against modern philosophy, using some of the terms of it, subverting it, and so forth. And it's I think, a very noble effort, borne lots of fruit, but I think has some really dangerous pitfalls along the way, which we'll get into. Most notably, it tweaks historic Reformed Christianity in three places: on the doctrine of the civil magistrate or of government. It renegotiates the way Christians think about pluralism, and the Reformed confessions would articulate the idea of different faiths in the public square. And lastly, it kind of it updates what the word conscience looks like. What does conscience mean? What does freedom of conscience look like in the modern world?
That's excellent. Okay, so that's good. That's beefy. For most people, they're still kind of going like, okay, but I'm not in the Netherlands, and I don't think I'm a Neo-Calvinist. So like, I'm thinking of like a silly like, you might be a Neo-Calvinist if. How would you define somebody, like, not to cast type too hard, but like, how would you know if you're a Neo-Calvinist, even if you haven't read Bavinck, you're not really doing that kind of stuff? Like, what are typical characteristics of Neo-Calvinists today?
If you have For the City in your biography, in any institution that you're a part of, you're probably connected to a Neo-Calvinist institution. If you think that the gospel transforms the world, and you like, or if you use, and that includes more, but that would be a tick. Okay, be looking for other signs. We hear the transformation language, which some modern Neo-Calvinists contest, but has historically been a good marker. If you are closely associated, or lots of people from Calvin College or Dort College or Calvin Seminary, if you believe in cultural liturgies, you've definitely been influenced by Calvinists, Neo-Calvinists. Oh goodness, I could go on. That may be a start. I can list some prominent Neo-Calvinists as well in the last little while, if you'd like.
No, that'd be great. Yeah, we'll get into that, because I think for me, it was like, when I understood this concept, there were kind of two things going on. One was like, if you go to an Acts 29 church, you are a Neo-Calvinist. Like, that's whether you like it or not. Like, and honestly, they should just put it on their website. We are a Neo-Calvinist. But the problem is that, of course, they probably don't even know that, and that's why I think the article is so important. It's a helpful kind of exercise in looking at how theological streams impact culture. One of the things for me when I interact with Neo-Calvinists is a lot of them will celebrate Kuyper, and I've used his quote, about every square inch and everything.
Great quote.
It's a great quote. And yet a lot of them want to basically take what was late 19th century Netherlands kind of approaches, whether they were good or bad, and then think that 150 years later, that the context on the ground is still the same, the atmosphere is still the same, and not only that, but it was kind of like peak. It was the end of history for Christian political engagement and thinking about the public square. And so, like, they kind of they read back into church history Neo-Calvinism. So then when we look at the Puritans or medieval theology or the early church, it's all washed through a lens of Neo-Calvinism. And that's why I think it's so helpful to talk about, because those kind of operating systems that maybe you don't even know you are become very influential in how you read literature, history, and even the Bible itself. So you talked about in the article, you go through kind of some of the history. So why don't you kind of unpack some of that? I mean, obviously, I think it is Gary Sutanto, the author.
Gray Sutanto, and he actually wrote, I think this might be the book you're referring to, Neo-Calvinism.
That's right.
Theological Introduction. Yeah. And Dr. Sutanto, he's a professor of mine at Union, RTS. We've had some fun conversations about this. He's trying to reclaim the title a little bit. He thinks it's been somewhat misused in a lot of the American context. I think it's interesting and relevant. And he would want me to say that, so he knows that it's not a monolith necessarily. But the way Neo-Calvinism begins is through particularly Abraham Kuyper, prominent Dutch journalist, politician, and pastor. And he's a liberal, and he kind of has, through pastoring his congregation, is converted to traditional Christianity. But his education formally is still very much in the mid-late 19th century, mid-late 1800s, and the language and the world of that kind of modern philosophy, not the Reformation. And he realizes things are terribly wrong in the Netherlands politically, and so he's kind of the head, a mix of the MLK / Theodore Roosevelt character of Neo-Calvinism. He does everything. He's always doing awesome, cool things. He's kind of a populist. And he's captured the imagination of dozens of pastors who also want to do everything, host a podcast like yours truly, and then also be a pastor and write books. And so he's kind of the fountainhead of this, and been the chief inspiration in the United States, because he would travel to Princeton Theological Seminary and elsewhere, Princeton being the most conservative Presbyterian seminary in the U.S. in the early 20th century, and give a number of lectures and whatnot. And then he had his right-hand man is Herman Bavinck. Bavinck is a bit more elitist. He actually grew up more in the conservative world, and is trying to break out of it a little. And there's interesting parallels between him and Karl F.H. Henry, who coins Neo-Evangelicalism, who was himself right before World War II, is trying to break out of American fundamentalism and saying, like, man, like our background is just, it's kind of provincial, it's small-minded, it's closed-minded, and there has to be some way of synthesizing all the ideas in the world to our faith. And I think in both cases, Bavinck and then Henry, who's a generation after Bavinck in the United States, both of them are very well intended and do very well for themselves in building a movement. So Bavinck writes these really creative, very well written, clear defenses of historic Christianity, updated for the modern world. He's also a member of parliament in Kuyper's anti-revolutionary party. That's the name of the party there. And so they're both politicians and pastors and theologians and academics all at once. And Bavinck visits the U.S. twice, notably, and pretty much says, yeah, Neo-Calvinism is never going to be the lay of the land in America, which is really interesting and important, because a lot of later Americans come along and say, well, I think it actually can be, or they're not even thinking on that level. They just think this is the way that we should move forward. So that's the history of early Neo-Calvinism. They actually govern, the Anti-Revolutionary Party governs the Netherlands for about 6 years, from 1900 to 1906. And I think that's actually a real pivot. It's a turning point, because up until now, Kuyper has started his own university, the Free University of the Netherlands. Was the Free University of Amsterdam?
Free University of Amsterdam.
Yeah, thank you. And then he actually starts his own denomination. He leads the moderates and the conservatives, what we would call the evangelicals, out of the mainline state church to start a free church and a free state. And it's really like a lot of reform movements. Like, it actually revitalizes a lot of things in the Netherlands at the time. It revitalizes true religion, like it's kind of evangelical revival, similar to what we see a few times in America's history. It's kind of like a John Wesley figure, starts a revival, but at the end of his life, his followers end up leaving the state church. During their government, though, something kind of strange happens. Protestantism is the most widely affiliated version of Christianity in the Netherlands' history when they come to power. 60% of Christians identify as Netherlanders, Dutchmen, and women identify as Protestant when they come to power. By the time they leave, that number's dropped 3 percentage points to 57%, that's pretty notable to have a 3 percentage point drop in their time there. Some of that might be the result of polarization or whatnot. But then over the course of the anti-revolutionary parties, not their zenith when they're in power, but when one of the major power brokers, the percentage of people identifying as Protestant Christian in the Netherlands continues to decline precipitously. And so by World War II, it's less than 50% of the Netherlands. What's notable is this decline begins when the Neo-Calvinists are in complete power, and only continues. So well before World War I, when you kind of have this great apostasy take place in a lot of Europe, it's already happening in the Netherlands. And so that's just worth keeping in mind. So now, in between World War I and World War II, Karl F.H. Henry, a Wheaton graduate in the United States, is frustrated at the kind of the fundamentalists fighting the battles of 20 years ago and wanting to modernize, sees these guys like Kuyper and Bavinck as the way forward. This is the political playbook for how evangelicals, as he sees them in the Netherlands, can come out of their past, take America by the horns, and steer her towards God. And so he launches something called the National Association for Evangelicals, which, if you've read Megan Basham's book, comes up a few times.
Yes.
And at the time, it's meant to unify the fundamentalists, the conservatives that might still be in the main lines, etc., Bob Jones types, even groups like the Mennonites and conservative Methodists, into like this union as a kind of a counter to the mainline Rockefeller-funded National Council of Churches, which was chock full of either communist sympathizers or dupes and whatnot. And so it's a very noble goal. It doesn't quite work. A lot of people kind of don't like Karl F.H. Henry. And if you want to read more about that story from a critical but not unfriendly guide, Apostles of Reason by Molly Worthen is a great book on this. She recently converted to Christianity at J.D. Greer's church, of all places. But this is written when she's still not a Christian, and she would say she's a pragmatist. She's a little bit harsh, but not unfair. Her adjectives might be sharp, but on the whole, I think there's a lot to be gained from it. And it's the best story I've seen from a critical eye of Karl F.H. Henry and the rise of what we now call just evangelicalism, which is now the defining term used by almost everyone in every book, whether you're trying to leave it and define yourself against it, whether you're embracing the title, whether you're trying to court them for political reasons.
Okay, so just to go back a little bit, with the Neo-Calvinist, I believe Karl F.H. Henry used the term neo-evangelical, but yeah. Did Kuyper and Bavinck use Neo-Calvinism as a term, or is that a historical term that we're describing them as such?
Funny enough, the first usage of the term neo-Calvinist, it's a derogatory one, and it's by someone, though, in Kuyper's own university. So there's a funny tension there, right, where Kuyper's being criticized by people in the university he just started on his mission to bring a strong Christian presence into the Netherlands. There's a little bit of irony there on a few levels, but it's originally a critical title, but it's pretty quickly embraced.
Okay. Got it. Many such cases today with certain slogans as well.
Slogans.
Yeah. So in the article, you highlight Barth. You don't highlight him a lot, but I do want to talk about Karl Barth. Okay. He's an interesting study. When I was in seminary, I had to read some Barth. I always found it very German. And in terms of its, the sentences are very long. It's like reading the Greek New Testament with Paul's writing, which was common in that day. But nowadays, like, Barth is very esoteric. Mm-hmm. You can't really figure out what he's trying to say. Yep. It's the word behind the word, these kind of concepts. So familiarize the audience a little bit with Karl Barth. I know it's not about Barth, but like, I think he's a figure that what I saw, at least in the academy and what I've seen, and I don't know if he still holds as much sway, but especially when I was starting seminary in 2011, it felt like the end of the wave had already crested with a lot of studies on Barth. In liberal seminaries, I believe Barth is appreciatively read, and Barth is kind of held up as this really great figure of the 20th century, who's a great theologian, obviously published an incredible amount of volume of works, but how does Barth play into this a little bit?
Sure. So Karl Barth is beginning to write right around World War I. He is a Swiss theologian in writing, but I think he's working in Germany for most of his career. And he is also trying to translate Christianity into modern philosophical parlance without giving up the transformation of individual souls, that Jesus is actually real and whatnot. Barth is doing this in mostly the Swiss, German contexts, and then pretty quickly it spills over into England and the United States. He is taking the best way to describe kind of his immediate influence, if you've heard the name Kierkegaard, it's kind of the idea that faith involves an encounter that's ultimately irrational and requires like a leap of faith. And once you take that leap, you can have this encounter with God that will transform your life. And it's all about the transformation.
Pause right there, because most evangelicals will hear that and go, yes.
Yeah.
And so I want to put a pin in that real quick and discuss it, because why would anyone disagree with that, Jackson? That seems very common. Like most of our parents, most of our friends who are in churches, evangelical churches, would hear that and go, yes and amen. So what, is there something wrong with that?
Goodness. Potentially. I don't want to say that everyone that says that, not everyone says that is a Barthian necessarily, but they've probably been trained by the language of it, right?
Yes.
Ultimately, it more or less, Barth kind of argues, the best I can say, and more intelligent scholars than I disagreed on this, that Barth kind of makes the faith to be beyond rationality, beyond something that can be understood. And because of that, you can only really enforce it. You can't enforce it legally or politically or socially. It has to be an encounter, an experience, like falling in love. And so I think it accurately described how a lot of people out of the hippie generation and whatnot, and earlier, but felt when they read Paul, and it made sense. Aha. It clicked well with a lot of the language of conversion, which is why Barth ends up being a Baptist. He's actually opposed to infant baptism, interestingly, even though he's in the Reformed Church of Switzerland. So with other notable, so I'll stop there. Is that good? Is that helpful?
Yeah, okay. I think so. All right, great. because it's a very, I think, important thread, not to pull necessarily here, but it's an important, just like something to consider if you're a churchgoer, like what is Christian spirituality? What is biblical Christianity, and how do we conceive of it? And how much of that has been shaped by either the Jesus movement or more upstream theologians in the academy like Barth. And it's the same thing with the Neo-Calvinists. So I just think it's an important thing. So let's pivot back from Barth. If Barth is Bavinck kind of an answer to Barth, or a better way forward? At least people perceive him that way?
That's a great question. Bavinck is thinking more holistically than Barth. Bavinck is trying to think that it has that the Christian faith has a public square impact, which Barth wouldn't deny, but because he doesn't think it's rational, it's really hard for him to actually explain what that should look like. Barth's primary, but they're both reactions to liberals. So liberals have this idea that society gets better and better. Jesus is ultimately the fulfillment of all of our desires and the culture. He's the highest ideal. And who really cares if he actually rose from the dead or not? Bavinck is fighting that and saying, no, Germans, Jesus actually did have to rise from the dead. So he's responding to that kind of argumentation. The Christian faith is real. The Reformation, specifically John Calvin, was getting at something very real. Barth seems to think the problem with denying the resurrection is you can't have an encounter with Jesus Christ. So it's more about the conversion and the transformation, the soul, the experience. Neo-Calvinists tend to actually really downplay the experience. So if a Neo-Calvinist institution very long, they'll tend to say it's not about the conversion. It's really, and that plays out in a lot of ways, in some healthy ways and maybe some unhealthy. But so that's maybe where they part. But I think, as I argue in the article, Neo-Calvinism is more helpful to evangelicals because Kuyper leaves his institutions and starts new ones. Barth stays inside the German academy, the state associated churches, and tries to show how justifying faith transforms you as an individual. So his faith is more individualistic and requires this institutional backing, which is why I think that for liberals who are uncomfortable, moderates to liberals inside mainline denominations, Barth was a very good justification to stay where you are and preach the truth. So if you look at kind of the last wave of the conservatives in the Episcopal Church, after the ACNA leaves, they're mostly Barthians. They're mostly Germans at bottom, because it's about the individual soul. It's not really about the corrupt institution, which can never be pure. But evangelicals tend to say, no, like we want to be pure. We want to have institutions that work, that are behind the mission and whatnot. And so Neo-Calvinism is a lot more helpful for that.
Okay, so getting into kind of some of the stuff you mentioned at the top
Yep.
with Bavinck, you mentioned three things, and I want to work backwards from the order you mentioned them.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned conscience, freedom of conscience,
Yep.
pluralism, and civil magistrate. So let's start with freedom of conscience
Yeah.
in kind of Neo-Calvinism. How do they conceive of it, and how is it different maybe than how Christians have historically understood it?
Yeah. So I'll say right now, this is not my strongest suit. So I'll only touch on this briefly.
Okay.
I think there's a good book coming out on this soon by some Baptist press that's going to touch on this more historically. What did the English Reformation think, and so forth. What I'll say is this: historically, in very brief terms, your conscience was your relationship to God. It's your inner soul, so to speak. The government could enforce civil religion upon you. You go to church, but you had to have true religion, which was the transformation of your soul. That was something that no one could enforce upon you. That's something that's between you and God. And this was kind of how state churches were run in the Protestant world. No, if you are a citizen in England and you went to hold elected office, you do not technically have to have to explain that you had a transformative experience when you were 11 years old to become a Christian, but you had to go to church. And so what you do is if you went to church, that would be civil religion. You were at the very least protecting it. You're doing the outward forms. But you were not required to participate, so taking communion and whatnot, unless you had true religion. This is against the Catholic model, which says that no, you have to convert and participate in these ceremonies themselves, and you do not have conscience. Because if you've been baptized, the church now owns you pretty much and can make claims on your inner soul. And the reformers that just doesn't seem like this is a 6-year-old who was committed to a monastery. They should not be held to those vows, right? Because that's really against conscience. Whereas the Catholics said you could. How that worked out by the 1900s, and Karl Truman's written on this in Strange New World and Rise and Triumph. Others have as well. That what's happening inside of yourself really needs to be expressed on the outside, and so your freedom of conscience no longer means you can go to church but not believe what you're saying, but that you should be able to express yourself in some kind of way rightly. Now it's sort of funny if you read like Bavinck on Christian education and whatnot. Well, they'll all say, and clearly there's limits on this. Like we wouldn't let people do, and then he says something that's very much legal and normal now. So there is a difference, but there's some level of expression, and that's what real freedom of conscience looks like: freedom of expression. So that's I think the biggest transformation that takes place, and Bavinck and the Neo-Calvinists are defending. They're with the modern tradition against the historic Reformed on that point.
Okay, so then that naturally flows in my mind to kind of a principle pluralism, as people might call it today, where there can't be any enforcement publicly against blasphemy or Sabbath or anything like that, because what matters most is the expression of the conscience, not the freedom of the conscience as historically understood. Would that be fair to say?
I think so.
It naturally has that?
I think so. And one of the ways this works out in Neo-Calvinist communities today, because there's very little not Neo-Calvinism in the Netherlands left, is you have every town, this is sphere sovereignty, is allowed to govern themselves more or less as they like. So you have this kind of rural belt across the Netherlands where all of the farms are, where you still have blue laws, you have very strict standards. I'm pretty sure that the most conservative element of this still doesn't let women encourage women to vote. So there's a very current conservative element, and they run certain towns that way. But they also don't claim to have any say over people that don't believe that or agree with those things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so then, of course, that naturally flows with the Neo-Calvinist understanding of the civil magistrate. I mean, we read these confessions from early modern history, whether the Westminster, the Helvetic, the London Baptist, you read Althusius, you read a lot of these guys, and they have a different conception of the civil magistrate than many Neo-Calvinists do. So how would you describe that maybe for for the listener? How does a Neo-Calvinist today conceive of the civil magistrate in contradiction to maybe some history in the church and the Protestant church?
So the way the Neo-Calvinists, and I would say most Americans conceive of it today, and this is part of why Henry's able to use Kuyper and Bobbing, is because they seem to be saying something pretty similar to what America has held, which is that the government exists to make everyone play nice and keep anyone from really stopping everyone else from believing what they want to. That's it in layman's terms. The government has a job to protect the different spheres, to protect the Catholics and their beliefs, the Protestants and theirs, the liberal Protestants and theirs, and not let any one of them enforce their way upon everyone else. And this sounds like what we typically call liberalism. I think that's because it is. It's downstream from that. And that's one of the things that Kuyper and Bobbing are interested in justifying is, look, guys, Christianity made the Netherlands the way it is today. In fact, this is what Calvinism was always supposed to do. And I think it's that pivot that's really important, is they went from this is the way Christianity gave us what we have to this is actually like the telos, the end result of what Calvinism was supposed to be. And in reality, how we got to the freedom of expression, the freedom of religion that we have is very political. It has very little to do with strictly like what ought to be, and much more with negotiations at a table after a bloody war. And not necessarily there's no benefit in it. Like, I think the American First Amendment, it works in a lot of ways, especially in a Christian society. But the idea was, that what the Neo-Calvinists do is they baptize that in biblical language and say, this is what certainly Calvin was arguing for. And if you read Paul carefully, he's also arguing for this. And so you have this kind of this creep of terms and whatnot, where terms like, because of the image of God and because of the human dignity, pretty soon, Christians for 2,000 years have run out the image of God, and somehow only in the 20th century they came up with like modern civil rights, therefore necessarily flow from it, right? So these are the kinds of things of like concept creep and more and more biblical justification for things that historically the Protestant church would have said are a matter of prudence, wisdom, and really left up to treaties and whatnot.
Yeah, that's the funny thing with all this stuff we talk about baptizing, is that I can appreciate the Neo-Calvinist kind of impulse, and in many ways that's what I was familiar with and I'm still very familiar with. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate a lot of the work they do, whether it's on Christian Worldview or Francis Schaeffer, or like, it's not to dump on that, but it is to say it's not the only way. And I encountered this in certain circles when I would start questioning the concept of missional, how it was this kind of junk drawer thing. And I was like, yeah, but like that concept, or winsome witness. I was like, yeah, that's a strategy. That is a prudential strategy that you can employ if you so choose. I'm choosing not to employ that. Am I free to do so? And they're like, no, that's unbiblical. And I'm like, whoa, we just went somewhere that I don't want to go. Like, I don't want to be unbiblical, And so like when you start questioning when I've made jokes or something about in the city for the city type stuff, people are like, you're questioning the Bible. And I'm really not. Like, if you want to run that play, have fun with it. I just, like, in my kind of like flow chart, my mind, I see the end result of that play and I don't like the outcome. And so I'm going to run a different play based on biblical principles and prudence, but they can't handle that. Have you experienced that too?
Somewhat, yes. And I've seen that. You see that a lot. And I think it's part of the way we as evangelicals talk is we want God to be on our side, right? So Jesus told me we can't be dating right now. And it gives a kind of moral authority. And so I see why it's done. But I think it leads to, you lose self-awareness. You stop realizing when things are matters of wisdom and not. Actually, I saw this at the John Piper, like Desiring God, like asked Pastor John, where he pretty much said, wisdom, if you're not being wise, you're sinning. And like, I don't know. I think that's more contextualized. Like, I'm not sure you can go quite from being dumb to being wicked. Like, I think there's a little more distance between those historically. And it has to do with a lot of things: maturation, age, context. Again, it's wisdom. Like it's
Right.
that's the nature of it. So I think there's a tendency to want to move away from that, because that leads to mystery and lack of clarity. And what
Right.
evangelicals, I think, have always prized themselves on is the Bible is clear, and
Yes.
perspicuity of Scripture. So the Bible is clear about salvation. The Bible is not as clear about everything else. If you read, like, 1 Peter 3, baptism now saves you. What? Like, through Noah, 8 persons, angels chained? Like, what? Not everything is equally clear,
Right.
and so I think that's probably where it comes from. But that's long been an America thing. Like, we've always tried to baptize whatever we're doing with the Bible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
for sure.
maybe it's just a cultural thing. We have to embrace it. I don't know.
I don't know either. Yeah, I should start saying, well, my way's the biblical way. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't like that stuff.
No, I know. I think
But
it's
yeah,
really
that's
dangerous.
funny. Okay, so you're coming from an Anglican kind of perspective. I could listen to you suspiciously as an Anglican. And so I'm wondering, with just as a kind of a sidebar on it, let's go to the War for Independence, the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Do you believe, would you say it would have been better back then, for whether in the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution, for there to have been some kind of state church? Or would it have been better for us to stay English and not have that war?
Yeah, good question.
In order to preserve some of the prior convictions of historic Christianity with regards to the civil magistrate, pluralism, and the freedom of the conscience.
Yeah. No. So, no, I don't think so. I think the War for Independence was not only justified. Sorry, John MacArthur, but it was it was the necessary and right thing to do. That doesn't mean every argument for it is equally good, right? Like,
Sure.
Thomas Paine may not be an equally good argument for it as George Washington saying, "Gosh darn it, this is our land by conquest. You can't control it," which is what they say in Fairfax Resolves. Him and George Mason say. So no, I don't think it would have been better. It is interesting. So I was just in England this summer, and at the British Museum, alongside tons of woke things apologizing for England in the bookstore, there are also things like timeline charts of the universe according to the Bible. And you have it was this big timeline from the 1800s about 4004 BC until 1895 when it was made. And the only other place I've seen this is Answers in Genesis Museum, right? But or there's some biblical archaeology books there too. And I thought that would never happen in an American Smithsonian, using Anno Domini, versus CE, So there are some interesting little cultural things where cultural Christianity does make an impact. But on the whole, no. But part of this is because the Constitution didn't forbid state churches. It forbid a federal church because we were a pluralistic country of different religions in different regions, especially. And most of the Anglicans decide pretty early on, the elites did, that we don't really have the infrastructure to maintain a state church. We can't even, so it would be almost impossible to enforce, and already had been for a while. So they kind of lifted the standards, and almost everyone became Baptist. Whereas in New England, where there was far higher social cohesion, which Tocqueville hears about, funny enough, that's partly allowed by the fact that they had state churches in Massachusetts and Connecticut until 1819, 1833. And Maine was also Massachusetts then. So you have state churches into 5 years before Tocqueville visits America and writes Democracy in America, 5 to 10 years. So I think that really impacts America. It changes the cultural imagination there and whatnot. But it's not strictly an issue of the Constitution. And guys like Patrick Henry, notably, were for a multi-church establishment where the Presbyterians and Anglicans could share the power and keep the Baptists from being legal.
Let's not go back.
No, that's right. No one wants to see the Presbyterians in power. If you've read any of Time and Klein articles, it's not a good idea. Don't give that man any authority at all.
All right, so let's talk more practically, because at the end of the article you kind of get there. we've talked about kind of cultural Christianity in England. This is a widely derided concept by Neo-Calvinists, and I don't know if Ray Ortland or Russell Moore would count themselves as Neo-Calvinists or not, but based on what we've talked about, I would categorize them as such, particularly because they have such a hatred for cultural Christianity.
Yeah.
And just some of my story, like I understand a desire for people to be truly Christian, right?
Yeah.
I understand. I was raised in a Christian school, went to a big church where I saw a lot of people who didn't really follow God, but they just did the thing. And so there's a sense of disregard for cultural Christianity. And these people have even suggested acerbically that thank God it's dying. Thank God Bible Belt Christianity is dying. It's good for Christianity. Is that a Neo-Calvinist kind of outworking? Is that baked into the cake? Like, where does that come from?
That's a good question.
Before we hear from Jackson Waters on that question, I want to make sure you know about Hillsdale's free online courses that you can take. And here's why I love them. I love them because I'm a big fan of history. If you know me at all and you listen to this podcast, I'm a kind of a history buff and I like studying history. And if you're a guy, I know what's on your mind all the time. It's the rise and fall of the Roman Republic. Well, Hillsdale is offering free online courses so you can actually learn about the rise and fall of the Roman Republic and not just rely on meme warfare for your education. They're free courses. They have tons of them over there, everything from C.S. Lewis to the U.S. Constitution, and they offer them at your own leisure. You can sign up, learn, and it's great to be somebody who is studying thoughts that, a lot of people think about, but not very deeply. We want people, and Christian men specifically, to be well-educated, well-rounded, and this is a great way to boost your own education, to be a man of intellectual rigor and seriousness by heading over to a trusted institution like Hillsdale. And so I want to make sure you know about that. We have a great partnership. If you head over to hillsdale.edu/proof, you can enroll today. There's no cost. It's easy to get started. And I want you to sign up so that you can let them know that I sent you. hillsdale.edu/proof to register today. Let's get back into today's episode.
I'm not sure it's quite that simple. So while I have been Anglican most of my life, I went to Briarwood Pres, where the PCA was founded for several years. And the pastor there, Harry Reeder, who I referenced in the article, will often joke that if you ever come to Birmingham, you'll see a lot of it, but it's pretty much a slice of heaven in the future. And he extolled cultural Christianity, which is interesting because he also called everyone to a very personal faith in Jesus Christ. And I think practically this is baked into neo-evangelicalism, so the American expression of it.
Okay.
I don't know that it comes from Kuyper or Bobbing strictly.
Sure.
I think but the frustrations they have with the state church are probably frustrations that neo-evangelicals would agree with and say, look at this. This is cultural Christianity getting in the way of the purity of the gospel. One quick thing I'll say on that is in the reaction to my article when it dropped last year, and it was a pretty big reaction. Someone asked about Leslie Newbigin and kind of the missionary church movement. And this is given to you by a pastor becoming a missionary church. And it's by two Neo-Calvinists, self-expressed, Michael Goheen, Timothy Sheridan. And the last third of it, last quarter of it, is on Tim Keller and the way he synthesizes Leslie Newbigin into Harvey Kahn, his PhD professor, who's a really pretty purist Neo-Calvinist at Westminster Theological Seminary, into what he does in New York City. So I think there's a mix of things going on. I think that has more to do with wanting to have fresh expressions of church and feeling like cultural Christianity is maybe getting in the way of that.
Sure.
I think it's a really bad instinct. It's a really, really bad one. The cultural fallout is immense. Your pet is not imminent danger because of the trying to remove cultural Christianity.
That's amazing. Yeah. So with kind of, you mentioned Keller, you mentioned Newbigin, who I benefited from. His book Foolishness to the Greeks I found helpful, but I guess would Newbigin be a Neo-Calvinist as well?
I don't think so. I don't know what his origin story is. I've only read the part of the book on Keller, so it's probably in the first 2/3 of the book.
Sure.
But I don't think he's strictly a Neo-Calvinist.
Okay.
But I don't know as much about him.
Sure. What are some institutions that people might be familiar with? Let's jump to neo-evangelicalism in America. What are some institutions that people might be familiar with that maybe they don't know was birthed out of neo-evangelicalism, but it was, and it kind of shapes how it operates?
If you know, InterVarsity Ministries or Press, Campus Crusade for Christ, now Cru, Fuller Theological Seminary, functionally Wheaton College, Gordon Conwell. Those are the name of top. Redeemer City, the City is a more recent one. The Gospel Coalition. Almost any evangelical publishing house. I need to check my sources. Baker and Brazos come out of this as well. It's my understanding. Erdman's has been seriously influenced by it. You can kind of go down the list. Crossway.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
So, okay. One of the things you mentioned earlier on Neo-Calvinism, we talked about conscience, pluralism, civil magistrate, how it's been influential in neo-evangelicalism. And you mentioned kind of this transformationalist streak in Neo-Calvinism. Mm-hmm. So I'd love for you, because with Theopolis, I think Theopolis has some unique perspectives on like ecclesiocentrism, which I don't need to get into that now. I'd love to have one of those guys on to explain it, because I've listened to a lot of it to try to understand it, because those guys are my friends. And yet, when I hear that, when you talk to a like, again, going back to the heart conversion, expression, your faith, those are important to most evangelicals in America. The same thing would be, I think, I found a lot of cultural cachet when you talk about how the gospel changes societies and that kind of thing. This is a very common way of thinking.
On earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah. So how is this different? Because if you're pinning that kind of concept, if you're saying Neo-Calvinism has that kind of baked into its system and its approach to the world and culture, how is that maybe in contradiction to the historic Protestant faith? Like,
That's a great question.
Like, should I not be a transformationalist? I thought we wanted Christ to be Lord. I thought Christ is King. Yeah. Like, how should we distinguish there?
I think you're looking at three distinct things. There's, yes. So the historic Reformed faith seems to put less emphasis before America on the transformation of society. Now, England is kind of unique. The English, which is, again, that's the language we all speak now. That's the history we're reading. They tend to have a more positive view of the gospel transforming society. The Puritans really want the gospel to transform society. So do the Scots. John Knox, the Scottish House of Lords almost comes to a deal with Mary Queen of Scots to allow pluralism in Scotland. They were the first case in the world of more or less a pluralistic society. But most, Kellerites would never say that, wouldn't want to admit this, but like, Knox says, no, she has to go. Like, we cannot have pluralism. We cannot have Catholics and Presbyterians worshiping side by side. God will smite us. Which is really just, it's interesting, to say the least. Now that Knox wasn't a real problem for a lot of people, and he was.
Sure.
But it's interesting to see, like, early Reform responses to pluralism. The theologians were like, no way, this cannot be allowed. And there's a shift that takes place over time where now the theologians are like, yes, give us pluralism, like at all costs, whatever it got takes. In America, it's a little different, obviously, partly because everyone kind of lives peacefully, and a lot of the worst elements of what we think theologians think will happen with pluralism don't. And that's partly because we weren't nearly as different as we thought we were. We were all actually still from England. We all shared a very narrow slice of English Protestantism. But as the myth grows, the problems grow too. And that's really a story of another time. So how does this relate to the transformation of society in the modern world? The Christian Reconstructionism as a movement, Rushdoony's name is attached to that. R.J. Rushdoony, who's an Armenian, originally, I think, PCUSA missionary, who ended up leaving and joining the OPC. And then Gary North, who I think was at Westminster briefly and then went to Cal Berkeley and got a PhD in history, and bankrolled early on, James Jordan and others starting a church in Texas. Those guys are growing up and coming of age in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, at which point there's this kind of an initial maturation of neo-evangelicalism. It's really come of age. Karl F.H. Henry's in his prime. This is the moral majority is getting started. And other guys that do go to Westminster Theological Seminary are encountering Neo-Calvinism. Now, these guys, the Reconstructionists, see the problems of a pluralistic society. They see these problems and more or less just try to say Neo-Calvinism is not being logically consistent with itself. And if it was being logically consistent, it would actually be like based beyond human imagination. Like we'd be like stoning people for adultery and whatever. And that's their thing. And so what I see in guys like James Jordan, who's kind of a father of on the theological side of this, he's taking it. He's taking a lot of concepts of the day and showing how they don't really go far enough. And if you build them out entirely and more biblically, you come to different conclusions. So I'd say but notably, he's like very anti-natural law still, which would be kind of in line with a lot of the more historic Reformation. So I put the Theopolitan types, which are one of the outgrowths of the Reconstruction movement, in kind of their own category of people that are inspired by Abraham Kuyper, but don't actually want Neo-Calvinism as it looked in the Netherlands or ever. He really is just an intellectual that helps work out ideas in the modern age. So does that help explain a little bit?
Yeah, because the question came up for us. I mean, at our church, we were kind of working through like, okay, 2020 hits, we kind of go like pedal to the metal on like trying to figure out what's going on. Both in our own story, both in our church, in society. And one of the questions came up with, even the way we talk about our church and what we're about. Before, our vision statement was like something like transform our city, creating disciples of Christ, which transform our city. And we had a great discussion amongst our elder team. And I was basically like, conversing with some pastors and theologians, like one of my guests, Glenn Moots, who is very, very good and historical on many matters. And so the question comes up, okay, so do we not want to transform the city? Do we not? I mean, because this is so like normal language to most evangelicals. What is it we're trying to do? And I think at the end of the day, historically, the church has a specific duty before the Lord to do certain activities. And when you broaden the scope of the church to be more transformationalist, it quickly leads into a lot of compromise or improper kind of like unctions that we should do all sorts of things that maybe the church isn't designed for. And it makes the pastor's job very difficult. We still stuck with like a lordship of Christ kind of spirit about us. We want the lordship of Christ. We want it to be pervasive in our lives. We want other people to know the Lord. We want to invite people to know the Lord. But there was kind of a less emphasis on kind of the transformationalist kind of perspective that we had early on. So that's still a question lingering in the back of my head.
It's in my mind too. I think it's very relevant because I don't think we can quite go back to just a Reformation era understanding. Like, we have matured as a society. More questions have been asked. And if we keep saying, well, the questions are bad questions, we might as well become like Eastern Orthodox or something, not ask any question beyond like iconography and get that question wrong. So like, I think there is something to, we have to be able to keep developing. I think that's what Theopolis is trying to do. It's not a pitch for them, but like, I think they're trying to deal with a lot of the questions that the modern 20th century asked and come up with like biblical responses to it. I think we'll have to see a synthesis of that at some point in the future. I will say like, but in kind of setting up the camps, there's a book, Christ and Culture by Richard Niebuhr, the less famous brother. And he kind of goes to different camps, and he has like transformationalism as one of them. And he kind of says he argues this is where Calvin and Augustine fall, which I think is questionable. But I think the questions he asks in those chapters about Christ and culture and paradox and whatnot, and the different camps he sets out, are all really good ones, and it's worth assigning people into them. Where do they kind of fall, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of it? Because I think they're all getting at parts of the gospel. Part of what the scriptures say about the human condition and experience. I think that's a very live question that needs to be asked, though.
Yeah, and I've found a lot of it's felt very safe, and not, I hope not in a bad way, but to just kind of go to the Reformed tradition and go like, there's kind of a traditional two kingdoms approach, where it's like, yeah, the church has certain duties and the magistrate has certain duties, and here's what our faith has historically taught about those duties, and here's what how we should pray for the magistrate, and here's how we should engage with culture, because there's so much literature out there, and I mean, the market is flooded with quippy paradigms like redeem, receive, reject, or how do we engage with these things? And so it's like you said, it's a live question that I'm very curious to investigate and help people. I want for my heart is for people to feel less. I want their passions to be for the Lord, and I want them to have great families that love God, that they worship together, they have a Christian education, all this kind of stuff. But the pressure that comes with kind of the Neo-Calvinist or just the kind of transformationalist mindset often leads Christians to feel like they're never doing enough. And I would pin this on like, whether from David Platt, how everyone should leave now and go to Pakistan, which he doesn't. But there's a lot of pressure that American evangelicals feel about their spirituality. It's got to be expressed a certain way. I've got to cry every Sunday, and I've got to transform my city, and I've got to save everyone at the workplace. And it's like, hey, like what if we conceived of Christianity more historically and just like stuck to kind of the basics first and got those dialed in. Yeah. And let's see what happens after that. If you have a passion for the homeless, I guess, like go, totally. Help them out. Totally. But yeah, that's kind of why it's a live question for me.
No, I think it should be for every church. I think the danger in the Anglican tradition was, and evangelicals, which were not transformationalists, was pretty much say your prayers every day, go to church on Sunday, even if you hate it. And like, that's it, that's your faith. Yeah. And I still know pastors are kind of like, contrary to the Neo-Calvinist impulse of like liturgy is everything, or kind of like, yeah, I actually don't like my service that much, but it's what you do. And there's like a real like austere like sense of duty, which is kind of admirable, but also like dude, you can actually enjoy the Christian life too. And so there's good literature that comes up, right? I think the modern era is trying to answer questions that are important. Last thing I'll say on this is the concept of the public square doesn't really exist in the Reformation that I know of. The idea of a public square that's separate from your individual self and from the civil government. So when the economy is mostly in the home, it just changes the way we have to interact. So how should a business hold itself, and how should a business be Christian when it's no longer in your workshop? Like those are questions that are not necessarily immediately clear and should be asked. And I think Neo-Calvinists have interesting answers. I just think that they're at rock bottom. Maybe the Reconstructionists are right. They're inconsistent with themselves about how they answer them. And that's why I think putting worship first, which is I think what guys, if you look at the Westminster, California folks, or D.G. Hart, just worship on Sunday, the Bible should be boring. And gosh darn it, you're going to like it. The impulse they're trying to do is this scene where Neo-Calvinism leads. You're going to burn people out. It tries to do everything. You lose the sinner. So anyway, but I think Theopolis does offer a way forward from that. A lot of the Moscow world is coming up in interesting and creative ways that are I think giving good examples for what we can be doing going forward.
Yeah, for sure. All right, last thing I want to ask you about, and I'll just read this quote and then ask about it. So pluralism, that is permanent minority status, is the status quo of Neo-Calvinism. The very idea of a moral majority is not just outdated, it is medieval. And so how does Neo-Calvinism kind of lead Christianity into a permanent minority status? Because I think many people who go to, otherwise Neo-Calvinist churches or affiliated or reading Crossway books who don't know about Neo-Calvinism, they would be horrified to kind of hear that, baked into your Christian spirituality and your view of the world, you are that's what you will be as a minority. And of course, some theologians suggest this is somehow good for society, so we should want Christianity thrives when everyone's dying and all Christians are being persecuted, you get that. But a lot of Christians, like my parents or anybody else, they would go well, that's not good for churches. That's not good for Christians. How is it baked in though?
Great question. It's baked into the system because you can't violate anyone's consciences, and fundamentally, you want to be winsome to convince people to like. You only have one tool. You only have the carrot, and so that's just going to really limit your ability to actually convince people on their own. You actually have to have a very tight knit society for carrots to be the only tool used. Mm-hmm. I think also notably, the history of Neo-Calvinism has just borne this out. It's most successful in places where evangelicals are a very small percentage of the population. And it's reduced the once powerful Protestant presence in the Netherlands to a tiny remnant. Similar in New York City, and I think Neo-Calvinism was most successful in New York City because it's actually historically Dutch city. It is one of the few truly pluralist American cities that functions well pluralistically. So I think philosophically it says you're not supposed to win. You want everyone to just protect all sides of the equation. If you read George Marsden's the outrageous idea of Christian scholarship, like just give us a voice, guys. It's like we'll like help the conversation. And they underestimate in a way I think actually most Marxists understand that culture, like all kinds of these things are parts of power. They all have an end. They all push people towards something, and it's better to have them push towards good things, even passively, than encouraging them with a Vanity Fair and saying this is really what true Christianity promotes.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I've taken enough of your time. I could probably keep talking about this for like hours because it's so much of my story. I think it's a story of a lot of Americans who may not even know what neo-evangelicalism or neo-Calvinism. I just think it's a well-written article. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Where else can people keep up with your work? Where are you writing? Where are you speaking? That kind of thing.
Great question. My Twitter handle. You can put it in the show in the notes too. I'm gonna I'll start writing more regularly for Theopolis hopefully soon. And then we're actually having a conference next month on October 4th and 5th, the fundamentals of Baptist education, and we're talking with some Baptist Theopolitans and whatnot on looking back on the fundamentalist controversy and maybe what are some ways forward from that. And that'll be at in Jackson, Tennessee. And I can send you a link to that too if you want to throw that in there. And I'll be speaking there. A lot of other good speakers. So
love to do that. Yeah, his Twitter handle for the listener is at JackMatt100. Very AOL Twitter handle there. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Anything else, Jackson?
Nope, not at all. This is fun though. This is great. Thanks for having me on, Chase.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. If you liked today's episode and my conversation with Jackson Waters, go ahead and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you are listening or watching or whatever you're doing to participate in Foolproof Theology. I'm so thankful that you're tuning in, subscribing, all that kind of good stuff. But make sure you leave a great rating, share the episode with a friend. Maybe you've got somebody stuck in Neo-Calvinism and they don't even know it. You can share this episode with them. Before we get off there, I also wanted to make sure you knew about and you had the opportunity to buy something from Ion Layer. I use these patches every week of my life. Ion Layer has a great way to help your NAD+ levels. These are key ingredients in your mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, of course. And you can go sign up over at ionlayer.com. Use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. They're super affordable compared to most IV treatments that a lot of people are getting out there. These are like a tenth of the price compared to those, but you can still get $100 off even that if you use code FPT over at ionlayer.com. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Go sign up there. It's a great way to stay fit, stay healthy, and even as you get older, as those NAD+ levels decrease, you can stay current with those. All right, thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.